Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to our panel titled Indigenous Struggles and Decolonization, Theory and Practice. Before we begin, I just want to say that in the bottom right of your see and hear the conversation in 3 different languages. So it will be interpreted thanks to our amazing interpreters. And so today we hope to connect the Kurdish liberation movement to struggles for decolonization and indigenous sovereignty within Turtle Island, North America, and Abya Yala, Latin America. While usually not thought of as indigenous people, the Kurds hold a long history of anti-colonial resistance against 4 oppressive ethno-nationalist states, which for a century has committed genocide against the Kurdish people, displaced and dispossessed them from their lands, and erased their culture through violent measures. In the Americas, indigenous people have also continuously organized and resisted the brutalities of settler colonialism for the survival of indigenous cultures, relations, and epistemologies. We are hoping that our speakers' presentation today will help us draw parallels between the struggles in these 2 parts of the world and open up a conversation about what it means to participate in indigenous and decolonial struggles, to think about decoloniality and indigeneity, and recreate alternative forms of social organization based on indigenous traditions and visions.
Thank you, Ariela. Primero, Carlos, ¿hay traducción al español? ¿Usted ha podido elegir esta opción?
No vi. ¿Qué tengo que hacer?
Hay un button.
Ya.
En el fondo, que dice English. Ahora dice English para usted, creo, o dice traducción. Hay que elegir, allá se puede elegir español.
Aquí hay interpretación. Está muy bien.
¿Sí?
Ya lo elegí. Sí.
Ok.
Español, ya lo tengo.
Ok, muy bien. So yes, just to continue, we are very honored to have 3 distinguished scholars and activists with us today. Ainur Unal, Carlos Mamani Condori, and Robert Caldwell. And we are also very lucky to have volunteer interpreters who have generously agreed to help us with the English-Spanish translation. It's Mariana Tarifa and Oriana Diaz de Vito, as well as our English Kurdish interpreter, Jalil Kaya. Once again, thank you so much for making this happen between different languages. And we're thanking all of our participants for finding time in their busy schedules at this time of the summer to join this important conversation and to provide this unique opportunity to the students of the Rojava University and Bremen University who are participating in this summer school, but also to the broader audience who is interested in these topics. So without further ado, actually, I'll just remind one more time that we do have translation. We have 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Kurdish, and you can choose the option that you need on the bottom of the screen. It should either say a language or translation. So yes, without further ado, we will start with our first presenter, Ainur Unal. Dr. Ainur Unal is currently an associate lecturer at Arden University, England. She holds a PhD in political sociology from the University of Leicester, UK, an MA in international relations with specialization in international law and human rights from Deakin University, Australia, and a BA degree in international community development from Victoria University, Australia. Her interdisciplinary research interests include indigeneity, discourse, indigenous rights, Kurdish political movement, indigenous peoples of Mesopotamia, internal colonization, post-colonial nation states, self-determination movements, national identity discourse, and critical discourse studies. And now I just realized that I read it very fast and I'm doing great disservice to our interpreters. So I will remind myself, Ariela, and our speakers, please don't hurry with your presentations. Let's make our interpreters' job a little bit easier. Okay, Ainur, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, great honor of being in this panel. Let me share, I put up my presentation. Here should be. Okay. Is it?
We can see it.
You can see it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Anya, for the nice introduction. I'm going to talk about Kurdish political movement and Mesopotamian indigeneity. Just before starting my presentation, I would like to briefly mention where I'm coming from to this topic. As Anya mentioned as well, read my bio, I'm originally from Turkey. When I started my social sciences studies in Australia, I become more familiar with the Aboriginal people of Australia, modern Australia. And I did my master's degree research paper on the role of Western NGOs within the global Indigenous rights movement. And I get the look at the global Indigenous rights movements from different continents, the Americas, Asia, Africa. And one of the important significant findings of my research paper, I noticed the peoples of Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, after the First World War, become the Middle East. It's having paid very limited attention. It's like the indigenous peoples of Mesopotamia just disappear into post World War, First World War nation states. It's like Turkish, Persian, or Arabs. And I also noticed that striking resemblances between global indigenous struggles and Kurdish political movement, which I'm familiar, as I said, I'm originally from Turkey, in terms of the rights they demand and experiences also within nation states. That's why I did my doctoral research on the indigeneity within the Kurdishness discourse, in the Turkey's Kurdish political movement. I'm going to share my findings and my interpretation of my findings with you. I'm basically going to talk about, since I am talking about contested definitions, indigeneity, ethnicity, decoloniality. I'm going to just briefly, from my perspective, which definitions I'm using through my researches, and going to talk about indigenous people's rights and discuss the internal colonialism and decolonization as the Kurdish political movements, the Mesopotamian indigeneity, how the Kurds going through decolonization, how they see colonization, internal colonization within the nation states in the region. First thing, one of the key concepts, indigeneity and ethnicity, like I said earlier, is that very contested definitions. While discussions surrounding concepts of ethnicity and indigeneity remain important within academia, Triga and Dallas points out that the critical definitions argue for a clear differentiation between indigeneity, either a race or ethnicity, with a specific category of indigenous peoples deserving a distinctive rights. And this is the academia is one of the definitions from academics. As well, always it has been a discussion who's indigenous, who's right. Is earlier, it's not a new concept in academia or international arena. Previously, it's the connotated had a negative connotation, like primitive, backwards. But since the talking about self-determination rights, now the discussions around mostly who's indigenous peoples, who have claimed these rights. As Linda Smith notes that often Western cultures are allowed to be diverse and contradictory, while indigeneity is expected to pair or one mind of aesthetic or easily identifiable. To eliminate to people who demanding their rights, that's the Western colonized mentality. It's the logic. They looked at the indigeneity concept this way. One of the anthropologists, Alan Barnard, is argued that there might be not only the definition of indigenousness as the situation of the indigenous peoples of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, or the United States cannot be seen as a privilege, or it's not the same situation as the indigenous peoples of Europe, Africa, and Asia. And we are now talking about relativity. It is the different interpretation of indigenousness. Barnard states that the acceptable point about classification of peoples as indigenous is not that they predate other people, but they predate state formation established to protect such other peoples. It's an important differentiation. It's apart from the classical definition of settler colonialism and indigeneity, to look at the different aspects, different continents of indigenous peoples. This is the Barnard's interpretation and definition is important. How it appears in international law is the I'm going to identify in the later slides as well. The significant shift occurred in 1989 when the ILO, International Labour Organization, is the first international supranational institution actually looked at indigenous rights, adopted the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention 169, which came into force in 1991 after being ratified by only 22 countries. According to Article 1, the convention applies peoples in independent countries who are regarded as indigenous on account of their descent from population which inhabited country or geographical region to which the country belongs at the time of conquest or colonization or the establishment of present state boundaries. It's which part, this part is also relates to Barnard's definition, and who, irrespective of their legal status, retain some or all their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions. The self-identification as indigenous or tribal shall be regarded as a fundamental criterion for determining the groups to which the provision of this convention apply. This is 1989. And what constitutes indigeneity is briefly, as I said, there is no single definition, clear definition. Definitions from anthropologists, sociologists, or recently growing interest in indigeneity,
en estudios indígenas y derecho internacional con sus definiciones.
بکارانیاجی دزگه نابنتوی ده لویدر هم تشتن هفپار همه جبو داناسیاجی پیناسه کردنا.
Having a unique language and culture, an identified ancestral territory or spiritual and historical bond to the territory is the most significant principle again in terms of distinguishing from ethnic minorities and self-determination claims. This is the reason is the ongoing struggle for self-determination of indigenous peoples. As indigenous peoples can claim minority rights under international law due to having a distinct language, culture, and beliefs, they also have specific rights, as I mentioned earlier in ILO's article 1989 convention. Also international laws and regulations. This includes, as I said, is ILO is the first organization, the Indigenous and Tribal Populations Convention is 1957. And then 1989, mentioned earlier, is introduced by the International Labour Organization. And most recently, 21st century, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in 2007. Even though some scholars argue that this is important to go through the institutional system, some scholars argue that the institution's role is basically maintain the colonial legacy, how important or how convenient to go through these institutions. But is knowing that a bit and research on it, the International United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not the institutional decisions, it's a decision of the over 4 decades of struggle from different indigenous peoples from different continents, the Americas and the Oceania, Africa, Asia. It's not the really, as I said, institutional. It's the indigenous peoples' effort to make that declaration. And what does the differentiation between, why is it important, the indigenous people's rights to ethnic minority rights? In 1992, the United Nations adopted Minorities Declaration and identified that the rights basically, is briefly included here, recognize the minorities' existence, efforts to guarantee their rights to non-discrimination and equality, the promotion of multicultural and intercultural education nationally and locally, the promotion of their participation in all aspects of public life. Okay, and indigenous peoples' rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all rights that ethnic minorities are entitled, and plus self-determination right and right to access and control over natural resources and their lands. It's this significance. This is the difference between ethnic minority rights and indigenous people's rights. That's why that's the argument I'm going to talk about in the Kurdish political movement, why they refuse to be the ethnic minority and how important, why important being, it's not, the good and bad or more or less in terms of rights entitled, it's the indigenous rights, as we say on the slide as well, is important. And the self-determination rights said that apart from fundamental rights mentioned earlier, the UNDRP includes one of the most controversial aspects of indigenous rights, self-determination. Article 3 identifies indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue the economic, social, and cultural development. It's the most controversial. And as I mentioned earlier, that's why, because of the self-determination right, is the indigenousness becoming questioned by many states, identifying them or denying totally or identifying it ethnic minority, and then the states will be avoided this self-determination right actually recognized under international law. And how indigenous peoples going through self-determination right. Why actually? Because of their experiences by states, colonizer. We talk about the overseas international colonizing or in-border internal colonialism. It's the scholars working on indigeneity and indigenous peoples argue that the colonialism never did for indigenous peoples. Still experiencing oppression, marginalization, and denial of their lands, their historical, onto historical land. And internal colonialism concepts to look at this, look at the experiences of indigenous peoples. In short, Chavez, that the internal colonialism seeks to explain the subordinate status of racial or ethnic group in its own homeland. The own homeland is the key, again, here within the boundaries of a larger state by dominated by different people. For example, the Navajos, whose reservation exists under the supervision of surrounding United States. And comparatively to its relatives, the internal colonialism theory provides a more thorough interpretation of colonialism within national borders, importantly, it clarifies the unequal position of indigenous more effectively than theories based on primarily on assimilation, diffusion, and immigration and the like, because of the experiences, because of the bond, the spiritual bond to the ancestral land. And the scholars assume the Desai and discuss the perspective of colonial logic. And Andreas on colonial logic points out that the logic holds that indigenous people must disappear. In fact, they must always be disappearing in order to non-indigenous people's rightful claim over the land. If they wouldn't exist and no claim at all, and it happened in post-stats for Kurds, denial, total denial, not mentioned. It's like it's no ethnic minor and ethnic background, people from different ethnic backgrounds, only one ethnic identity. That's the colonial logic, internal colonialism perspective. And decolonization. Indigeneity is response to the demands of contesting colonialism. It's creative and creates new solutions to new problems. This requires humility because decolonization is moving towards a different and tangible place, somewhere out there where no one has really ever been. It is to be able to go through, as I said earlier, decolonization, unity, indigenous peoples recognize the colonizers' attitude towards, indigenous peoples on their own lands. Ultimately, the strength of our indigenous cultures, Wilson says, rests in our ability to exert our humanity through the decolonization of our minds and transformation of the world around us, while recognizing that our truths stem from the eternal nature of language, ceremonies, worldviews, and values. That's the strength of indigenous struggles. In this part of the oppression, marginalizations, and denial of their land and identity by the colonizers, and they maintain their values, identity, and that's the core of is their minds and the struggle for transformation of the world around them. And Kurdish experience, I would like to I provided a bit of background what I mean by internal colonialism and decoloniality, how it happens, how it occurs in the Kurds case in Turkey. I looked at in my research the Turkey's Kurdish political movement. I looked at the political parties, the programs and statements in relation to Kurdish issues, and interviewed with Kurdish politicians within pro-Kurdish political parties, the current party in the Turkey parliaments. And literature reviews suggest that the experience of the Kurds in Turkey, the underdevelopment of Kurdish populated region, is pretty similar. And as I said, from my own experiences from Australia, when you look at Australia, one of the wealthiest country in the world, but the life standard of Aboriginal people in Australia worse than so-called, I'm not really comfortable with third world countries, but less than the third world countries. And in Kurdish, forced internal displacement, especially in 1990s. Over 40,000 Kurdish villages, unfortunately, had to force the urbans in the West. The banning of the Kurdish language, non-recognition and denial of Kurdish identity and its historical existence, assimilation practices and marginalizations also experiences among the Kurds in Turkey. One of the well-known scholar and activist, I would say, Ismail Beşikçi, actually also studies the Kurds and Kurdish experiences within the colonized states. In his book, International Colony of Kurdistan, And the Beşikçi says the United Nations Declaration on the Grant of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, number 1514, on December 1960, should be considered differently for overseas colonies and border colonies, while 1, 2, 3, and 5 of these 7 closed edition encouraged the independence of overseas colonies, 4, 6, and 7 encouraged the prevention and suppression of decolonization and liberation movements in border colonies. Actually, that is the declaration in 1960 also covers, actually also address the experiences of indigenous people within the states in border colonies as defined. But is the in the previous slide, is the Beşikçi says there's unfortunately it hasn't applied to Kurdish case, not even recognized an identity, ethnic identity, and also experiences even genocide in Iraqi Iraqi Kurdistan, by Saddam Hussein in 1988, I believe. And in Turkey, studies of Kurds in Turkey, the Republic of Turkey was established as a nation state in 1923, and with this change, the existence of Kurds was denied. From the mid-1920s until the end of 1980s, the Kurdish states assumed there was no Kurdish element on Turkish territory. One of the well-known scholar again on Kurdish studies. Doesn't mean after 1980s Kurds recognized as ethnic identity, recognized as a problem, Kurdish issue, because it's emerged as a guerrilla movement and then the political movement. And the Kurdish political movement emerged to claim of constitutional recognition of identity based on equal citizenship. They're claiming their identity plan and cultural rights, education, and media and communication in mother tongue. And there's of course self-determination in their own region, and proposing actually self-determination is the form of alternative governance model for whole Turkey, not only for Kurdish region. And then I'm going to share my findings briefly. As I said earlier in the beginning, I looked at the 4 main principles of indigeneity: self-identification. In Kurdish case, is the Kurdish political movement, the members of Kurdish political movement, I would say, they are absolute refusal to being ethnic minority, as identified as. They identify themselves Kadim Halk in Turkish, but in English, the ancient nation, ancient peoples, one of the ancient peoples of Mesopotamia. And they also identify themselves Asli Unsur in Turkish, which actually means a primary constituent of the Turkish Republic. There was an agreement, they claimed that there was an agreement between Kurdish delegates and Turkish delegates during the independence for Turkey, just during the First World War. And the agreement was they, after the war, build a nation, 2 nation states with Kurdish and Turkish. And later on, Turkish state, of course, denied Kurds. And the cultural linguistic significance, they claim that recognition of Kurdish as a mother language, demand education in mother language, Kurdish, and demand media and communication in mother language. Historical land to homeland, recognition Kurdistan as a social, cultural, and historical homeland of Kurds. And self-determination claim, they claim that from independent, united Kurdistan, the democratic Kurdistan in Turkey, Aremi Merkeziyetçi, it's called the democratic confederalism, the form of the Kurdish political movement, not really organically tied to the PKK as a guerrilla movement, but is the ideological parallels between them. And the PKK started as declaiming, demanding independent, united Kurdistan, but the now Kurdish political movement as the model governance model is the democratic confederalism, is based on active participation, women, equal women participation in governance, and environmentally, ecologically right to governance. And self-determination claim, as I mentioned, evolved from independent United Democratic Kurdistan. Now is through the 19th and 2005, it's more focused on strengthening local governments, going for more decentralized. And since 2005, it's called the two main terms is use democratic confederalism and democratic autonomy. And we can see here the parallels between the Turkey political Kurdish, pro-Kurdish political movement to Rojava Kurdish political movement based on same ideology. And decolonization in Kurdish political movement, one of the scholars works on this issue as well in decolonizing Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir is considered the capital of North Kurdistan in Turkey part. And cultural identity and struggle to appropriate urban space. Decolonization and de-Turkification of Diyarbakir were initiated by the DHAB, Democratic People's Party, which is pro-Kurdish party in municipal authorities when they won 1999 local elections, but proliferated when various social actors engaged in the process. What happened when the pro-Kurdish political party won the Diyarbakir is created a comfortable safe space for Kurdish and become and normalized with people more tend to use spaces for culturally. It was the process of the Turkification. This political movement led to, in 2015, one of the current pro-Kurdish political party got into the Turkish parliamentary. Yeah, ongoing struggle of decolonization, fortunately, like other parts of the world, in Turkey as well, in the region as well, Kurdish political movement struggling. In the local elections, just an example, in 2019, the current political party won a total 65 municipalities, including 3 metropolitan municipalities, 5 provinces, 45 districts and 12 town municipalities. And as a result of trustee appointments, only 4 districts and 2 town municipalities remain. Democratically elected country, elected mayors from pro-Kurdish political party, unfortunately, had to step down because of the government's intervention.
I'm very sorry, Ainur, for interrupting your very insightful presentation. I'm wondering perhaps you could try and wrap up so that we have enough time for Q&A in the end.
Yeah, okay, I'm about actually finished. Okay, this is my conclusion. Why Kurdish political movement is important, not only for Kurds, also the other peoples, indigenous peoples of the region as well. One of the MPs is resemble the political ideology, democratic confederalism, like Hani come with the other indigenous peoples, as you can see, and like I said, the invisibility of indigenous peoples of the Middle East or ancient Mesopotamia already is already pointed out in the beginning as well, not only in scholar academia, also in international institutions as well. To conclude, as Kurds identify themselves as one of the ancient peoples, Karim Halk in Turkish of the Middle East, democratic confederalism governing model introduced by the Kurdish political movement of Turkey is promising self-determination model, not only for Kurds, also for other peoples of the Middle East. And Kurdish political movement again also paved the way for all whose identity, culture, and land have been colonized. And thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And before we start answering questions, we'll move on to our next presenter, Carlos Mamani Kandori, historian and activist for the rights of Indigenous people. He was a member and president of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues between the years 2008 and 2010. He is also a professor of history in the anthropology and archaeology departments of the Universidad Mayor de San Andrés, La Paz.
Carlos, usted puede empezar.
Muchas gracias, Ariela. Buenas tardes, profesora Unal y a todos los que nos ven o escuchan. Soy de un país que
جبو هر کسی که نحل ما گهداری دکن از جولاته کی
Originally was called Cozigio. The Spanish and they called the real audience of the Charcas. Charcas was also a group of towns that were previous to the arrival of the Spanish. And finally, with the independence, we were called Republic of Bolivar because Simón Bolívar was the one that
creo que es un ejemplo muy claro.
ناوی ما بو بولیویا و بولیوار جبر کو ناوی ما جوی جامعه بناوی بولیوار ته تشته کو the درباره colonial
peoples in all of the American continent. Genocide is a fundamental element, a foundational element for the establishment both of colonial administrations with Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, etc., and also for the settlement of republican states. However, this matter isn't recognized by the American history, Latin American history, or by any type of politics, internal politics of any of these countries. Generally, what is pointed out is that what happened in the United States was a demographic collapse, but we never talk about the genocide as has happened, for example, in all of the Antilles, with Cuba, the Republic of Santo Domingo. And today, there aren't any indigenous peoples. These places have all been populated by people from these continents that I've mentioned. And this has been doing of both the Anglo-Saxon and the Latin American communities. And because of this genocide, we established colonialism has been established, and we have important resources, especially of precious stones as silver. For example, in my country, we were rich in potassium, and therefore it was seen that it wasn't really convenient for them to get rid of the native peoples, but it was a good business to make native people to convert native people into workers of the colonial system, and that in some way has salvaged our existence. We're now a minority, the ones that are part of many parts of South America, what happens in Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, etc. I'm not going to talk about colonial history. I'm just pointing this out. And then we have the independence phenomenon, and that's a tricky subject because generally Latin American independence is seen as a decolonization process. and the colonizers or the colonized had a civil war with metropolis, especially the Spanish American one, with political problems, both liberal and political issues between the great powers, especially England, that was interested in disputing colonial spaces. And then we have a breakage between the colonies and the metropolis, and the foundation of republics that have been republics of the colonized, so the of the colonizers. And so the Indians, then we went from colonization to the nation states that we have now. And then we talk about decolonization. I'm not going to talk about either to the Republican system. I'm just going to point that, for example, between the years 1840s and 1860s, there was a recolonization in the whole continent. It's very recognized, for example, in Argentina, what's called the Desert Campaign, which was basically an ethnic riddance of the indigenous peoples that were inhabiting what was called Argentina. And the funny part to me is that Argentina, as my country, these are countries that have been invented, because these are names that have been invented. They aren't original names, their own names. So these invented countries establish a law to exterminate the native populations, in this case, Mapuches, especially in the southern part of Argentina. And then in Chile, we have the pacification of the Araucanía. In Bolivia, there was a close relationship between the colonizers and the colonized. So the Indians, especially the ones from the Andes, couldn't be exterminated completely. There was a desire that the Indians were going to disappear from the earth, from the Andes, but that wasn't the case. Although the Bolivian state carried out a war against the Guaranis, as in that time they were called Chirimanos, and so they were beaten and enslaved at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And when Bolivia had an international war with Paraguay, then the Guaranis were completely invisible, were made completely, and and it wasn't known whether they were in Bolivia or Paraguay. They just disappeared, and the jungle towns where the Guaranis are even start being present in Latin American countries in 1960 to 1917. So in that process, it's very important for our struggles, the emergence of politics that are based on the word indigenous, but the politics is called indigeneity, which was applied from the Mexican, so that the India stops being Indian and turns into Bolivian, Mexican, Argentinian, etc. And the important thing is that in the 20th century, especially between the 30s and the 50s, this way of thinking of building the state in our continent starts to be linked with the politics of international organization. It's the indigenous person is conceived as a worker in mines, in factories, in the bigger cities, but not as a nation totally disposed of their identity. And in that sense, I think it's also important to remember that the ILO when it was created, I think it had one primary, one colonial mission of how to administer the work situation in colonial countries. So I think it's important to remember, for example, the 29th agreement on forced labor, but at that point, they weren't thinking of indigenous workers in the Americas. They weren't thinking of what was at that point called independent countries. They were thinking of the workers of non-metropolitan territories of the colonial countries, which were all of Asia, all of Africa, that the big powerful European countries controlled. So the relations between the ILO and the Europeans start when in Chile.
De pensar en los trabajadores indígenas, ¿no? Entonces ahí tenemos la historia entonces del indigenismo de la OIT y el indigenismo latinoamericano.
I'm sorry, I think we have a problem here. I think we're hearing English in the Spanish channel. Is that just me? Right, the English translation is in the Spanish channel.
This is interpreter speaking. Sardar,
could you double check, please? Okay, it looks like it's fixed. Sí, podemos seguir.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I was telling you that between 1936 to 1957, we have a history of effort between the ILO and the Latin American indigenism of making the Indian do not disappear physically, but as a collectivity, as an identity. And that was called by the European anthropology ethnocidi, not to exterminate them physically, but to kill them in their identity and in their rights. So we have in the ILO history the agreement 107 that foresaw the assimilation of indigenism to the states. At that time, something important happened in Bolivia. It was the 1952 revolution that established that the indigenous peoples are part of the Bolivian.
اوجی بون پارچه که نتوا بولیویا بون و دور دهن ماف هاتن ناس کردن که اوجی پارچه که وی نتوی نه و
turn into Bolivian citizens. So nonetheless, at those times, a new way of thinking appeared. It's called Indianism. It's like a shout from the indigenous people saying that they do not want to be Bolivians. We want to be indigenous. We want to recover what we were before, Koyasuyu, from the Incan time. They are political organizations that appear, and political organizations that, like the ones established in Bolivia, that are also established in Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, North America, in the United States, and in Canada. And so they think about what is the Indianity. We call it Indianism in the South, but in general it's called indigeneity, and there is a Canadian leader that thought that the countries in the third world struggle to become a block of the third world. We are going to build the fourth world, that is the peoples without state, without government on our own. So it's under the idea that the indigenous, the continental indigenous societies struggle to change the 107 agreement, and they had a reform, and they had a new one that recognizes all the rights that Professor Unal has already expressed. And then we have all the story about the UN Declaration on the indigenous peoples that recognizes the pre-existence, the right to the government, and the self-determination. And to finish with that, it was in the frame of that at the continental level, that the indigenous peoples, well, it's a little bit difficult now, say we are not indigenous Indian. It's an internal debate that we have, and we chose for the reconstitution. If we were victims or object of assimilation policies, we have to go back to be what we were, to organize as we were organized before the Spanish came. And their arrival of the Spanish to these continents is very old. We are talking about 1532. So how were we organized before that? So what happened with the Spanish is that Spanish people established their indigenous communities that were a copy of the farmer societies in Spain. So the indigenous authorities here say that we are going to rebuild the IU, that is our own way of organization. If we reestablish it, we are going to reestablish our authorities. The Mayuku was some sort of reign, and it was recognized through a symbolic element, that is the greatest bird of the Andes, condor. He was recognized as this bird, and finally establishing the IUs and the provincial organizations previous to the Spanish. We are going to reestablish the Koyasuyu, and with all these efforts in the Indian level, it's a crazy idea, but we have the right to dream and to reestablish the Tahuantinsuyu, that was the Incan state. There is something, a fundamental thing in the Andes. We had a state. We were not tribes. That happened in the Amazon basin, but in the Andean, in the center of the Andes, we had a very old presence, statal presence. So our is different from tribal or organizations. So that's the idea of reestablishing our own states. On the other hand, the political struggle has has led us to establish the plurinational state. The first case has been in Ecuador, second in Bolivia, and now we have finished with the Chilean constitution, where Chile says it's a plurinational state. And the most important thing is that when the constitution is written, it is recognized the pre-existence of the indigenous nations, and that denies the unicity of the Bolivian or Chilean state or any other state that will have a colonial origin. So Chilean, Mapuches, Aymaras, we all are part of the plurinational state. That is the way of thinking that takes the Chilean lawmakers that are working to make that constitution and to have it approved. In our case, it's gone through that way too, but it is important that the Indian peoples have had weakened institutions. We have been through weakened in our politics. In the case of Bolivia and Ecuador, we just stopped at the constitutional text. The advances have been scarce. So as at the level of the indigenous peoples in the world, we say that the implementation of the rights that are recognized by the UN Declaration on the Indigenous Peoples, the right to autodetermination and participation, and the instrument that leads to them, that is the consultation of free, previously informed way of choosing. We say that we're still missing a lot of effort, and that effort there isn't another way of dialogue with the state, only through mobilizations, protest, death, because those rights are written in an international declaration and that have been adopted by those states, but those states themselves do not recognize them. So in the same way, the recognition that the construction of the plurinational state is a challenge today on how we build a plurinational state. And well, we are going to finish with that colonial in the case of the south of our continent, based on the idea of race, in the skin color, in the surnames. For example, my surname is Mamani. My name is not Spanish. So the fact of carrying that surname, it allows discrimination, that I will not be able to get a good work, a good payment, and despite the norms and laws that are against discrimination, with the colonial customs, the norms and the laws are presented, but they are not to be followed. So they are only they only exist to be informed to the UN and to other groups, but not to be accomplished. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Gracias a usted, Carlos. So we are going to continue with our last, but not the least speaker. We have Robert Caldwell, who is a visiting assistant professor of American Studies at Brown University and of Native American. Sorry, I was in the Spanish channel, just realized that. So I'll restart. Visiting Assistant Professor of American Studies at Brown University and of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Hampshire College. He's a fellow in the Ethics and the Common Good faculty and staff of Color Program 2022-23, as well as of Race, Indigeneity, and Settler Colonialism in Global Perspective at the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies 2021-22. His wide-ranging interests include transnational history, foodways, migration history, resistance and revolutions, historical geography, cartography, and the history of exploration and discoveries. His dissertation focused on thematic maps of American Indian homelands, languages, and culture areas. He's revising the manuscript for publication with the University of Nebraska Press. I hope this was more or less up to date, Robert, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So today I will try to be brief and to focus on some comments on anti-colonial, decolonial, and indigenizing spaces. This will be a discussion of some issues of indigenous relations, epistemologies, and survivance. I want to talk about the importance as well as the limitations of cultural resistance. Well, I think probably everyone that's participating understands that the US is a settler colonial state, one that is built on slavery, land dispossession, and genocide. A lot of historians nowadays like to say that the US is built on the twin pillars of stolen land and stolen labor. The US, of course, is also an empire. While some on the far right would love it to be a monolingual Anglo-ethno state, it is a US empire with internal colonies. And whether is from the vantage point of the far right or liberalism, multiculturalism, the US is a multilingual polyglot state. And as such, either if we want to focus on the perspective of the settler colonial state or the empire, we have to consider that liberation is a task for many different oppressed communities, often living on the same land or in proximity. And for me, that means the indigenous peoples of the lands, the African descended peoples that were brought in chains, whose ancestors were brought in chains to the Americas, and so-called immigrants. These are, in my mind, the internal migrants of the Americas, the indigenous peoples who are now in the United States, but who come from south of this colonial border. And so when I talk about cultural resistance, I'm talking about a lot of different things. Land, being able to hold land, to steward land, to take care of the land that is taking care of us. And there are many ways in which to do that, varying from liberal ideas like land trusts to statist ideas like land in trust, to capitalist ideas like the purchase of the land for holding amongst indigenous peoples. Secondly, governance. Governance is it's a very important part of self-determination. And I list this actually as cultural resistance and not just political resistance, because governance might in many cases be limited. In the US context, there are 568 federally recognized tribes, and about 300 more in which the United States does not recognize. And this, when I talk about federally recognized tribes, I'm talking about what the US calls domestic dependent nations. These are what people probably in the 70s and 80s would have termed a Bantu state, states that are dependent upon the stronger colonizer state. So we have reservations or some semblance of internal self-determination, but of course, nothing like a military for defense. And of course, external relations with other states is always disallowed. It is one of the hallmarks of the US government to try at every turn to disallow indigenous peoples from having independent relationships with other indigenous peoples around the world, and especially other states. So 568 of these kind of domestic dependent nations with fairly permeable borders, the allowance of internal policing, but internal policing only as it applies to native peoples, not to non-native peoples. So it's a very kind of limited set of governance. But we also govern internally according to traditional ways. So that is very cultural. Other cultural forms of resistance include language. That's language continuance, language survivance, but it also includes the resurrection of languages that were sleeping, or which some people say were lost or gone. And so many tribes now, many indigenous nations are working on a revival of languages in which there is no living fluent speakers. Of course, we also have ceremony, food and foodways, and indigenous horticulture, our own education, housing, healthcare, medicines. And I think maybe the most important for most indigenous peoples in Turtle Island is kinship. Our notions of kinship is that we are all related. All of humanity is related, but we're have sort of specific forms of relation, specific forms of kinship. And this is not just based on blood or birth, as the United States government would have it. They're focused on blood quantum and lineal descent. They say that our citizenship should be made up. They say that it's up to the tribal nations to decide, but ultimately they also say that it has to be people who are indigenous by blood, which is quite different than our traditional forms of kinship, which included adoption and other forms of fictive kinship. Now, all of these forms of cultural resistance, I think, have been growing in power and in action. And there is something that can definitely be said as a real cultural movement going on within Turtle Island. But there are some difficulties. One difficulty is there's no kind of united front or umbrella coordinating body. The National Congress of American Indians, which was formed in 1944, is an organization that fights for rights, for human rights, for basic rights, and for defense of the various tribal nations, but it is ultimately entrenched and enmeshed in the web of funding, etc., with the United States government. Other more radical organizations have emerged from time to time. Some people on this in this summer school might be familiar with the American Indian movement, AIM, whose height was the late 1960s and the 70s, which the organization basically collapsed due to COINTELPRO, which is the counterintelligence program of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This was a program of the FBI to purposely discredit and neutralize organizations considered subversive to the US.
ریخستنین که دوزا مافی گلین خجهی دکرن اوانا پوچ درخستن و او تیک برن بطایبتی سابوتاجک لدجوان تفگران هات کرن و همانتش لدش چندین ریخستنین دنجی هبو انگو فرقاوی تشتی جتشتين كو أمريكا للدربي ولات بدستي CIA دكه پر فرقاوي تنل ناب ولاتش بدستي FBI دكن.
A radical coordinating body or something like a united front between more reformist and revolutionary organizations. When I say that there is a sort of a cultural revival and there's social movements, this takes many forms, including land acknowledgements in which institutions within the US, public and private institutions, acknowledge that they are operating on stolen land and seek to build relationships with the indigenous peoples whose land that was. Another sort of challenge in my mind is that there are many thoughts, intense focal points amongst the movements, the social movements, centered around rebuilding a right relationship with Mother Earth and moving towards liberation, in a way that sees the interconnections with all oppressed peoples, but the challenge is, of course, you have many different conflicting sort of strategies and tactics. You have reformist demands, you have revolutionary demands, you have what some people used to call transitional demands or non-reformist reforms. And these things all come up ultimately against the coercive power of the state. And this can be seen in the Canadian state context with the Oka crisis or the Kanistakare resistance, 1990. We could see it in the Idle No More movement and the No DAPL movement in the US against the pipelines. You know, simple, what I think is very much a part of normalized protest within a liberal state, people protesting against pollution and the destruction of traditional homelands by pipelines suddenly is met with tanks, rubber bullets, water cannons, etc. Many people from movements around the world don't bat an eye at this, but it is a real eye opener for many people in the US context, both indigenous people and especially non-indigenous people. So talking about these kind of social movements and sort of social movements that are attached to, but try to go beyond cultural movements. I think one of the strongest ones is Land Back. Land Back, you can look at landback.org, landback.org. This was a project launched by a group called the Indian Collective. The idea is really pretty simple, is you know, that indigenous peoples stewarded the land for millennia, and that land that was stolen should be returned. And as part of that, there are many ways in which that can be returned. The land could be ceded from the state. It could be purchased by benevolent third parties. It could be simply divested from large landowning corporations, etc. And Land Back is an interesting movement because it does not seek to bring all of the participants into the organization. This might have been called in the past, in the 20th century, something like a front organization, but is really about the mission of Land Back and not just about building the Indian collective. And I think that in many ways, both this group, Land Back, which you can see online, focusing on land, language, ceremony, food, education. So land, but land in a very broad sense. And another organization, The Red Nation, that's THEREDNATION.org. Both of them have a pretty basic entry point, but ultimately call for very, very far-reaching demands. And when I say far-reaching demands, I'm saying an end to capitalism, colonialism on a global level. So ultimately, these are visionary organizations. The organizations themselves are made up of a tiny minority of a tiny minority. When I say tiny minority, indigenous people within the United States, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians represent less than 2% of the population. And 2% of the population within a two-party system with many winner-take-alls makes it very difficult to participate in the normalized sort of so-called democratic sphere. There are 5 indigenous people in the lower house of US government, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and there is also the Secretary of Interior, who's Deb Haaland, our first indigenous Secretary of the Interior. But ultimately, the call to sort of for political change through voting rings a little hollow. American Indians as a whole have not had US citizenship since 1924, and in many states still struggle to practice basic rights of voting. So trying to sort of, get at all of this, I think that fighting for acknowledgement, the fight for treaties, the fight for increased relational sovereignty against the settler colonial state and empire, fighting against the sort of paternalism, that doctrine of the domestic dependent state, or these Bantu stands which limit our self-determination. I think, looking at the limitations, they're very real. Just like the discussion before with the other speakers, I talked about decolonization, and I think it's impossible to decolonize many institutions, including the university. We might try to infuse them with indigenous ideas, indigenize them, but these are institutions that were never ours. I much prefer the older anti-colonial terminology and the brand new indigenizing terminology, because many institutions cannot easily be decolonized. And to speak to Carlos's, one of his many excellent points, I would say that in the US context, you do not have the indigenous as worker or campesino as you might have in other places like Ecuador, or Bolivia, or Mexico, or Peru. And that's because of the thoroughness of the genocide. It's less than 2% of the population. And so in the US context, indigenous peoples are often seen as non-workers, as people who are face structural difficulties to work, and that's often pathologized. And so it's the sort of other side of the colonial coin, I would say. Another limitations to the politics of sort of recognition, I think, is the discussion about UN DRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. I mean, this essentially, in the US context, I think in many ways it's a step back instead of a step forward, because it does not allow for the representation of indigenous peoples except for through third-party NGOs. So indigenous peoples actually don't have a seat at the table. Global capitalism, through its kinder face, the liberal NGO, has a seat at the table in which they voice some of our concerns. And so just want to put that critique out there. And then going back to the comment I made about the US never liking solidarity, the US always being against indigenous people building solidarity with other oppressed peoples in the world, and especially with other nations. This could be seen with the Miccosukee Seminole, who the US, in Florida, who the US refused to recognize in the 1950s. So their leader, Buffalo Tiger, led a group to Cuba in 1959, had discussions with the new revolutionary Cuban government, following which Cuba granted them international recognition as a sovereign country within the US. And then the US quickly responded by approving the Miccosukee's constitution and officially recognizing them. And so I think that there is power. There's so much power in building international solidarity. It's not just ticking off a box and saying, well, solidarity is the right thing to do. Solidarity and grassroots sort of global relationships, I think, are the way, and one of many important tools for building power for all of our peoples moving forward. Before before Maduro came to power in Venezuela, was my suggestion to my tribe, for example, that that we should send a delegation to Venezuela and build a international relationship there. My experience of being a Hurricane Katrina survivor in New Orleans was that, this other country, Venezuela, sent fuel oil and gasoline for our shrimpers and fishers and other types of support that the U.S. government refused. Even Mexico at that time, still with at that time with a corporate right-wing government, even attempted to bring aid, in which the U.S. disallowed. So I think solidarity is absolutely important to me. It is a tool for building power, and it's what really just made me so very grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation. And so I hope that in the talk you got something of the situation, the landscape in the US amongst Indigenous peoples. It's hard to consolidate the situation of over 560 independent entities and many other internal colonized peoples like the Borican, the people of Puerto Rico, the Native Hawaiians, etc. And so I hope that this was useful, and I look forward to an ongoing conversation for the rest of our time here today, and invite anyone on this call to contact me via email for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you to other speakers. We do have, I think, enough time for a conversation and to engage in the ideas that have already been expressed and raise some new questions. We already have 4 questions in our Q&A box. And I think I will start with the question that came in second from an anonymous attendee, because I think it could be a good question for all 3 of our speakers. So the question is, do you see indigenous sovereignty as possible under the current nation-state system? Does the nation-state system need to be dismantled for there to be true indigenous sovereignty? And I would add just another sub-question, whether the indigenous communities or movements you are working with, whether they are proposing any more egalitarian, liberatory visions to transcend as alternatives to the current nation-state system. So whoever wants to start.
I can say that my own community in Louisiana is not proposing something so radical. In fact, they're one of the 300 something communities that the US acknowledges as indigenous, but still refuses to have a nation-to-nation relationship. And so, one of the big points there is building stronger relationships with the states rather than trying to dismantle it. However, my own personal opinion is that the United States as such must be dismantled for indigenous people to have our rights, our customary rights, and for humanity to have liberation. It is my belief that the US in many ways holds back our liberation, both
ببینن
on Turtle Island and those living
اوين كل غرافا كوسيان بمرة دجين واوين كل لوفر ناجنم دوان دبينن يلك نتوهنا كو لغرافا كوسيان كو عرضي وان ديروكي
contemporary communities straddle these colonial borders. And so there are many attempts to defy that, both through demands of treaties, including quite old treaties, through in some cases, the creation of indigenous passports, like the Haudenosaunee one. And so I hope that was at least a good starting point.
Yeah, I can go next. I am working on the Kurdish political movement. Actually, the Kurdish political movement indeed propose an alternative in the nation state of Turkey. It's the only opposition party in the parliament. Turkey's parliament now is the HDP, and it's the only political party includes the People's Democratic Party. People's is a multiple identifies it because it's recognized not only Kurdish, is other indigenous peoples like Armenian, like Assyrian, like Yazidis, Czechs, and Laz, and propose a model for the strengthening local governance, local communities, is propose an active participation in democracy. It's a new alternative way in Turkey. As I said, it's not the opposition to current government, it's opposition to establishment, it's alternative to establishment of Turkish Republic. And it's already, it's not actually utopia, it's happening. I believe, it can be achievable, because it's unfortunately, we're talking about democracies, but Turkey democracy has a 10% electoral threshold. It should be, when we're talking about democracy, should be about representation, isn't it? But is the pro-Kurdish political party managed to get through this 10% electoral threshold and get into parliament? And that's the first time in Turkey's parliamentary history when pro-Kurdish political party got into parliament, and that's the first time actually the women of MPs in the parliament, the highest level, because of they introduced co-chairship models, which is new to Turkey and the whole world, I believe, democracy as well. In summary, I believe it's something new, could happen, and it's happening already in some part of the world. And I believe it's with solidarity will be, I hope it answers the question.
Bueno, yo responderé. El Estado plurinacional en
The
cierta
plurinational state, in a certain way, is the dismantling of the nation state, right? Because first we establish, as a starting point, it's established the preexistence of Indian or indigenous peoples. Therefore, it's not just a unique nation. That's why I was saying we're facing a challenge to dismantle the Republican colonial state system, independent from the colonizers that remained in our countries, that are now the ones that are now called settler colonizers. However, in countries like Chile, I think it is possible to establish a regional sovereignty of the Mapuche people. It is very important. The Mapuche people is very important and very strong. And I think nowadays with the new constitution, we're gonna see the results where this is gonna take in the negotiation of sovereignty between the Chilean state or this Chilean nation with the Mapuche people. With which people do we work? Well, in my case, it's the people's, the identity. We have like 3 languages, Imala, Quechua, and Urutipaya, and these are us, but there's also a lot of mixed people, and they are also identified as scholars, and that's a different type of struggle. Here in South America, I think the thing is more about how do we control the state, and in the case of Ecuador, for example, the national Confederation of Ecuador is a political party in which they were democratically about to capture the political power. It was just some votes that stood in the way of doing that. So we're close to having Indian governments.
Thank you very much for your responses. I'm on the Spanish channel again. I'm not going in order of the questions, but I just want to ensure everyone that we will answer them all. I would like to ask a question that came from a student of the University of Rojava, Sipan Ismail. And thank you, Sardar, for translating it for me. Sipan wrote it in Kurdish. So the rough translation is, what are the venues and tools that Indigenous people can create or use to enforce their rights and protect themselves? And I think one aspect of this question is about self-defense and how it is practiced, in the territories that you're familiar with. So again, anyone can jump in to respond.
I can actually say a few words here. I think it's the answer is the collective action, is the mobilization from grassroots. That's the best answer. Again, it's solidarity, understanding from different perspectives, knowing your rights. That's why, of course, I'm not suggesting, I'm not a big fan of established colonizer institutions, but it is the way to, one of the ways to go through. Like I experienced how the Kurdish political movement, pro-Kurdish political party parliament, and made a difference on Kurds. As a Kurd, Kurdish people, I'm not originally Kurd as far as I know, but I witnessed that they getting into the Turkish parliament and speaking on their language and communicating with their language in Kurdish, which is not recognized in Turkey, but using that language is make difference. It's coming from grassroots. It's coming from mobilization, institutionalizations. I believe is the collective action. If you ask me, is the answer. Will be.
I think that I agree entirely on the question of collectivity. I think that really is the strongest point. I think that there are some cultural aspects in the Canadian and US context. There are some growing movements. One of those is the movement of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And this is because Indigenous women are stolen, sex trafficked many times, murdered. And so there's been a number of community responses, action alerts, phone trees, but also organizing women's self-defense courses, including lethal and non-lethal self-defense courses. I think many of the First Nations or tribal governments are fighting for the right to prosecute non-native or non-Indigenous peoples in those tribal courts. Also, more protections within the colonial framework, for example, the Violence Against Women Act. Also, in the US-Canadian context, there is a growing movement of Two-Spirit peoples to reclaim identities beyond the gender binary. These were identities and gender divisions that existed within different Native nations, sometimes 3 identities, sometimes more. But the idea of reclaiming these identities and doing so in a way that both is illustrative to the broader culture, the dominant culture, but also to Native peoples. And so, for example, in a lot of urban situations like Toronto, Canada, or San Francisco, there are now two-spirit powwows. These are gathering places in which people can come together and have a sense of some collective power, right? Of some sense of belonging, and from that build towards cultural change.
En mi caso había
In my case, I had affirmed that the reconstitution is the result of all of the Indianization politics that we've had in the South. And the reconstitution means establishing our territories, because colonial management, as the Republican one, what it did was dismantle our territories, our identities. Therefore, what we've done is rebuild territories at a community level, at a second organization level, recovering the ancient provinces, Cuyas or Incas, and thinking of rebuilding our country as our own. And this is a very strong project, because it's a project that involves us as peoples that have been dismantled by Republican countries, as is Argentina, Chile, and Peru. In the case of Peru, we've been divided into different states, and the reconstitution is the only possibility of going back to having a unity. But also with the reconstitution, what we've done is reestablishing our ways of government, our authorities, and reestablishing our ways of government and our authorities. We've strengthened our ways of thinking, especially political ways of thinking, the way we get organized, how we manage our territory, how we manage justice, right? That in spite of the Republican state, now in spite of a Republican state that lives under the mask, let's say, of a plurinational state. So I am very confident that the reconstitution processes are going to take us to that so wanted decolonization, because what happens in the Andes has also been happening in Mexico or in Guatemala, where indigenous populations are majority, not only as it's 70 or 80% of the population controlled by a small minority.
Thank you all for those answers. I'm going to move to another question that was in the chat. It was noted that there is a lack of a united front when addressing Indigenous rights issues. Could the panelists discuss what organizational capacities they imagine a confederation of Indigenous struggles would fulfill? And just to expand, what does decolonization, how do you imagine decolonization? What are the possibilities for solidarity in decolonization, and how can we mobilize towards this?
Bueno, vuelvo entonces al tema de la reconstitución, porque en verdad...
Well, I go back to the reconstitution subject, because we think that the reconstitution is a way that in the Andes are going to lead us to the decolonization. Why? Because the authorities, the colonial administratives and in the Republican authorities they are authorities to keep the privileges, the white privilege of the colonizer privileges. There is no solidarity towards us. The Indians, the white writers in the 50s and 60s were conceived as producing machines to produce wealth for the white people. So what was the solidarity that we could have? And the Constitution led us to recover the main principles of authority and our own government. And that is solidarity. There was a Indian journalist in this 17th century, Felipe Juan Poma de Ayala. He said that the Incan government was a government where there weren't people with hungry or with not access to water, people that were cold, because we are a very high country and we have cold weather, but nowadays we have people searching for food in the garbage, not access to water. Those basic needs are not satisfied, and in general, or well, beginning with the um, indigenous authorities have the mandate to warranty those main needs for food, education, health. In our language, we call father our indigenous authorities. They are our fathers, mothers, and we are their children. But when they are the colonial authorities, they are not our parents. They are our oppressors. They are those who suck our blood, and in that way, it's how people express themselves. So it's clear why we have to reconstitute and what is the advances. We have problems. There are things that I can express, but we started with the ILU reconstitution after 1992, where we celebrated by the Republican states the fifth centenary of the encounter of the old world and a new world, the European and the indigenous world. And at that point, we started to think, how did we face that celebration and the continuity of colonialism? So from the ILU reconstitution, it arises not an organization arise, but not exactly an institution, but a political movement that is called Koyasuyu institution, with the main organization points based in an urban center where the authority resides. So the CONOMAC, that is the name of that council, it proposed the re-territorialization, because the country has a territory that has been divided in provinces by the colonialism. So this council proposed to have it divided again, because in cases as in Bolivia, in the Andes, we have indigenous population that is in the rural world, and we also have indigenous population in the big cities. So the matter is, how do we make the reconstitution move to the big urban centers? So we are in the middle of a reconstitution process. It is very clear that we cannot redo a decolonization as the examples that we had for the indigenous movement, like Armin Carcaval, the African That was a very important example for the leaders during 1970s and 1980s in my region. So here we are looking for the decolonization through the reconstitution.
So we do not have much time left. I know Robert already responded to this question briefly in the Q&A. So perhaps we'll just finish off with the remaining question very briefly. It's for Ainur. Could you elaborate on the historical bond to homeland part of the UN definition of indigeneity? My experience engaging with indigenous activism is mainly in the climate justice sphere. So I have always heard indigeneity as defined by a deep ecological connection to land and the non-human beings who are also of the land. I'm curious to hear about whether you feel this is also relevant in the case of Kurdish indigeneity. Okay, very briefly, please. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I try to explain it. Actually, it's the historical land, is the spiritual bond to historical land, one of the main principles of indigeneity. And in Kurdish's case as well, is the Kurdistan defined as Kurdistan as never being a political entity. It's been a Kurdish state and in different forms, but not as a whole political entity. But every part of the Kurdistan, in 4 states in the Middle East, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, different parts, they recognize Kurdistan as a whole is the social, cultural, and historical land of Kurds. And they say they talk about kingships. Kurds from Turkey has relatives just in Syria. Kurds have relatives in Iraq or Iran. Regardless of the governance model, ideology, political ideology, they support each other's self-determination claim as well, because of the whole idea of Kurdistan. They say the North Kurdistan for Turkey is Kurdistan, for example. That's why it's related to. That's why they consider themselves one of the ancient people, ancient to land, actually, Kurdistan. I just try to be very brave.
Thank you so much. We'll appreciate that. So we are going to wrap up now to end on time. I just want to thank again our panelists and everyone who has been behind organizing this panel, Sardar and the rest of the team. And of course, our interpreters, Oriana, Mariana, and Jalil. Thank you so much. I hope we have not exhausted you completely by going the full 2 hours. And Sardar, would you like to make a brief announcement of the remaining events of the summer school?
Of course. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And we are incredibly lucky and honored to have you all participating in our summer school. I very much appreciate it. Thank you, Anya and Ariele, for organizing this seminar. And thank you to all of our interpreters who did an excellent job interpreting from English to Kurdish and Spanish and vice versa. There is a symposium this weekend organized by the students of the University of Bremen and the University of Rojava. I just posted the link in the chat box. So if you can come, would be great. There is a panel by John Holloway. I think that would be very interesting, and some other activities. And we have one final seminar for next week on Tuesday that also covers some of the educational projects by indigenous people, both in Rojava and in Colombia. And you can basically follow our programs on our website, which I also posted in the chat box. Thank you very much again, and have a good one.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. Nice meeting you.
Thank you to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you.